Welcome to this podcast, which is sponsored by the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. The title of this podcast is On Artificial Intelligence and the Lived Experience of Being Human. We subtitled the podcast that it's on the fourth great blow to human narcissism, which is a reference to something Freud said, as I will explain shortly. I'm very privileged to have in the studio Professor Stephen H Sidley. Professor Sidley is at the University of Johannesburg Business School, where he's a professor. He is the author of very important books on topics such as cryptocurrency and AI. He is also an author of several novels, and he's a great saxophone player. Is there any other way, Boyke, that you'd like to introduce yourself?
I will take that. That sounds good to me.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you here, Professor Sidley.
Thank you.
Artificial intelligence. Freud, 3 times in his published writings, said that there were 3 great blows to human narcissism. And we have to think about what those blows were and whether they really were blows to human narcissism. And I'll come to that in a moment. I met Professor Sidley when he first gave a talk, or when I first attended one of his talks on artificial intelligence, and I was blown away. And I was blown away because I knew far too little about the rapidity of new innovation in artificial intelligence and the implications of it in terms of the accelerating rate in which AI is able to do things far better than humans in so many spheres of our endeavors. I was blown away, and in a certain sense I was appalled. So I started to meet with Boyke and talk with him about this, because all through his lecture I kept on thinking, what's going to happen to humans? What's going to happen to humans? And indeed, that is really what we are focused on in this podcast. Freud said 3 times in his writings that there were 3 great blows to human narcissism. The first was Copernicus, although arguably Alexandrian science had also discovered prior to Copernicus that the sun does not revolve around us. The second was Darwin, although also the work of Alfred Wallace would have been very relevant, telling us that we evolved from animals rather than being in the image of the divine. The first is a cosmological insult, the second a biological insult, and that was the word that Freud actually used, a great blow to narcissism, a great insult to human narcissism. And then he said, I have provided the third great blow to what he called, quote unquote, our naive self-love as humans. And the great blow is the discovery that we are governed by unconscious forces beyond our control. Now, we could ask, before we get to AI, what does it mean to have a blow, an insult to human narcissism? In a way, Freud is assuming that part of our narcissism, our healthy narcissism or unhealthy narcissism, depends upon our identification as a human being, our identification with the species. Then I think that's questionable. How much of our self-esteem comes from the idea that we are human, and how much of it really comes from other sources? But you can see the blow that the sun does not revolve around us actually does not really greatly affect the life of an average human being. It still appears as though the sun revolves around us, even though if we know abstractly from Copernican science that it does not. Similarly, the idea of the Darwinian revolution challenges certainly aspects of the Judeo-Christian Islamic theology. But does it indeed really shake up our sense of how important it is that we're human? In some ways, it doesn't. We still tend to think, and we're taught in elementary school, that we are the greatest species. We have language, we have symbolic reasoning, which appears that not many species do. We also, as a species, more than any other animal, are suicidal and are destructive of our own habitat. So the idea that we're the greatest sometimes seems a little thin. We also go to zoos, we go to trips on safari, we kill animals, and this too is a part of human grandiosity. But the third revolution, Freud's, really is of a different caliber. Freud says we are controlled by forces within us that are not our own. Forces within us that to some extent we have exiled from our self-consciousness, the dynamic unconscious that he discovered and elaborated in the course of his work. That is a blow, but it's also a blow that many, many people, a majority of humans, have managed to ignore. The resistance to psychoanalysis, as Freud himself knew, is considerable. We can ignore the discovery of the unconscious, and to some extent we can happily go on believing that we are in charge of ourselves, master of our own destiny. So in the course of my conversations with Boyke, with Professor Sidley, I came up with the idea that what we have here is actually a fourth great blow to human narcissism, but it's a blow of an entirely different caliber because it is going to concretely affect the lived experience of every human being on the planet. And it is an error, I think, just because AI and computers are machines, it is an error, and Professor Sidley will elaborate this, to believe that we're in charge of it. We invented it, therefore we're in charge of it, therefore it's okay that the invention of AI accrues to our sense of grandeur as human beings. And maybe that is not the case, and maybe it's a profound error to think in that way. So this reality of the escalating capacity of AI to outstrip human performance, and the way in which AI is increasingly going to permeate every aspect of our human lives across the planet, really has the potential to be the most serious blow to human narcissism, the most profound unsettling of ourselves and our place in the world. So, Professor Sidley, Boyke, I'm going to ask you to speak about AI and to educate me and the listeners about the AI revolution and why this revolution is in a way of far greater magnitude than I think many of us realize.
Good. Thank you. And Barnaby, thank you for having me here. So AI burst upon the zeitgeist and public imagination, as everybody knows, with the release of ChatGPT in November 2022, but most listeners would be aware that it had been around for a long time. In fact, if you go back into the history, particularly of art, writing, poetry, etc., it has been around for thousands of years. And, when I've been doing my research, I tracked in how many creations of humans dreamt of or were scared of artificial life or human assistance or automata or anything approaching artificial intelligence. And it turns around that thought has been with us since recorded history. The formal development takes place in the 1950s with Alan Turing. There was a best-selling movie made from his work, Artificial Intelligence. And research started in earnest from the 50s onwards, but was slow and fell into many winters and was unable to get much traction at all, even though everybody knew where they wanted to go with artificial intelligence, was to get to a place where they could at least mimic what we generally call human intelligent behavior, but beyond that, perhaps exceed it. And there were a series of perfect storms that happened from 2000 onwards. The cost of hardware dropped, and the cost of communications dropped, the cost of storage dropped, and training material became freely available because of the internet. And most importantly, there were a bunch of statistical and mathematical formalisms that people had been thinking about for a long time about how the human brain worked. That all came together in the first two decades of the century, which resulted in ChatGPT and what has happened since. What has happened since 2022 is those statistical formalisms called transformers have been applied to magisteria of human intellect across a whole slew of domains, ranging from language understanding to language interpretation, to deep reasoning, to creativity, to mathematical ability, to predictive analysis. And in all of those, at this stage here, when this podcast is being recorded in early in the first quarter of 2025, we find that it is at or has exceeded human capability against most, if not all, of those axes. And there's about 10 of them. I'll tell you exactly what those axes are. Those axes are image classification, visual reasoning, language understanding, language inference, multi-language understanding, reading comprehension, competition level mathematics, software coding, reasoning, predictive reasoning, common sense reasoning, etc., etc. And if you have a look at the graphs, you will see that all of those graphs have become asymptotic, meaning that they are just about to exceed human capability or will shortly do so. Go ahead.
No, I was just about to make that clarification. Yeah. The list of things, the list of capabilities that you've just read out are all things that we're on the verge of having computers do better than we can. Is that what you were trying to convey?
Yes, and more on the verge of. In some cases, they've completely exceeded human capability by many, many times, and others are just about there. So the first point, and I'm going to make 4 points over here, Barnaby. The first point is that AI already exceeds human capability across many areas of human endeavor and of what we like to think of as human intellect. But then we get into, well, what things do we feel is protected by our species? What things do we have a level of anthropomorphic arrogance about? And it is things like poetry, it is things that are emotion-based, it's making music, it's dance, it's painting and writing. And when this thing started off, particularly ChatGPT, there were commentators all over the world, including academics, saying that AI is never going to do anything useful. It's just going to be able to regurgitate and be a mimic in the areas of creativity which are so important to how we've developed. It turns out that that is not true. Across all those endeavors now, you will find creative and novel outputs coming from AI systems, which are, number one, unrecognizable as having had the provenance of AI. In fact, in other words, if you play the piece of music or show the artwork or show the writing to a human being, he will not know whether this is a piece of AI or if this was created by a human, number one. And secondly, this is not regurgitation. The way that one of the great errors that people make, Barnaby, about AI is say, well, this is just you suck in a bunch of training material and it regurgitates. That is not the way that AI works. AI makes lateral associations between billions of different things and comes up with novel output, just like we do. And I want to give you an example of this. An art student goes to university and she attends lectures and she looks at art and she gets books and she sees movies about art and she goes to galleries and she gets her lectures and she has all this context put into her for 4 years at university. And then she goes off into the world and she becomes an artist, and this swirls around her head, and then she becomes perhaps a professional artist. And she puts together some new thoughts based on the training input she got at her 4 years at university. She becomes an artist and does something creative. That is exactly the way the training corpus works in AI. It sucks the stuff in, it swirls it around, and it tries to find novel relationships between things. Sometimes novel, sometimes not novel, but certainly can output things that are completely novel and new, just like a human being. So there are now examples in the creative fields where there is better output coming from those machines, from those software systems, from those AIs, from those large language models. Perhaps not, as we had discussed previously, perhaps not yet Picasso or Beethoven or Mozart, but certainly better than the large rump of professional musicians out there. So I'd like to knock down that skittle that AI cannot be creative. It is not true on any measure. The third issue out of the four I'm going to talk about, and probably the most important, is that the way these systems are being written is they will be able to not only operate autonomously, meaning without human input, but they will be able to operate and learn autonomously and increase their rate of learning. So you have what is here, a machine that learns faster, and I'm talking about millions of times faster than a human being, does it on its own, more importantly, can form its own goals, and is often running and outside of our control. Completely outside. And there are many, many scenarios, which we probably don't have time in this podcast to talk about them, where one can imagine this thing completely escaping our control, learning at billions or hundreds of billions of times faster than ours, having more access to information, and being something that we can no longer control. There are a lot of efforts around the world to try and control those via agreements, and they, as usual, regulation does not run at the speed of innovation, and they are not being successful. Item number 4, because the stuff can write its own code, it can build its own AIs, and it can build its own AIs at a rate and with a rationale that we cannot understand. So not only does it lose our control, but we cannot comprehend how they work. That is true today. If you take ChatGPT, and there's a particular output of ChatGPT, you cannot reverse engineer. You cannot climb under the hood and find out how it did that. It is beyond our control. We do not understand it. They're incomprehensible, and that is because of the massive data, the massive statistical combinatorics that are going on under the hood. Let me just stop there and ask if you have any comment.
No, I think that's your 4 points, which I'm going to reiterate because I think they need to be really taken in, and you're presenting stuff that is, for many of us, myself included, in some ways very disturbing. The first point you made was that AI already exceeds human abilities in many, many areas, leaving, in fact, a shrinking number of areas in which it does not exceed human ability. The second point, is there some area invulnerable, human-specific, as you were, that AI cannot encroach upon? And you give the example of the art student, which I took away 2 pieces from. One is this art student becomes an artist on the basis of a fabulous wealth of education. But the fabulous wealth of education is not as large as the AI machine has access to.
Yes.
And then you debunked the idea, as part and parcel of that, you debunked the idea that AI is only as good as the data you put into it, which is something I've heard again and again, because you're making it clear that AI can use data in creative, and you use the word novel, ways. That again encroaches upon the idea that there are things human can do that AI cannot. And then I think the third point you made, which is in a way, to me at least, the most disturbing as someone who is an amateur in this whole area, not very knowledgeable, is that AI can act autonomously. It can write its own code. It can create its own. Children, as it were, and that in that sense, it becomes out of human control, which you then reinforce that with your 4th point, that AI, even ChatGPT, can do things, and we can't tell how it did it.
Yes, right.
We can't do what you call reverse engineer it. That's no longer possible. That is a very powerful, powerful point.
Correct. And what makes this very concerning is if you want to put this in some sort of easy, human, understandable framework, what is really going on here? We have kicked off the evolution of what could be considered as a new species. I don't want to over-egg that point, but if you think of this AI, which is self-learning, self-reproducible, and evolving against its own goals, you have what can be called a species. Not only that, it's outside of our control, and it's doing stuff better than we are. And then we start thinking about, well, are we ending our own species? And that is only peripherally connected to what we're going to be talking about shortly in this paper, which is its effect on our psychology. But that becomes a large part of what sits in the background is, are we making ourselves redundant over here? Are we making ourselves redundant? So when is this all going to happen? the ChatGPT, which is built on the large language models, only arrived in 2022. As I said, by the way, it was based on a paper that was only written in 2017, which was the mathematical formalism behind it. So this stuff is not even a baby yet. The stuff is just blinked once or twice in a lifetime, given our couple of 100,000 years as sentient bipedal species. This is very, very young. When is this going to happen? So here's the interesting statistic around this. We know that in all areas of human endeavor, let me just say most areas so we don't get any blowback, AI has taken over or is taking over. So you ask a bunch of experts, well, when is the point at which it takes over all human tasks, at which it's better than humans in all human tasks? And you will find a range of answers from experts in the field. All of them are in years, not decades. So the latest I've seen in a big study of 2,778 of these AI experts was in the 2040s. We'll get to it. That's called AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. But you immediately leads to the question is, when you get to some point in the future where most of human activity is now done better AI, and the stuff is learning and evolving its own new internals, how soon before it becomes super intelligent? It exponentially grows away from AGI and into ASI almost immediately. We're building a super intelligence.
Yeah, when I heard you speak about this previously, you mentioned, I think, 2 studies by Akacha Grace, in which I think there were 2022 and 2024 publications, in which even AI experts underestimated the escalating, the exponential rate of development of these sorts of things. And then you come to this very important distinction between artificial general intelligence, which we already have, and super intelligence. Is that how you referred to it?
Yes, ASI.
ASI,
yes.
In which AI becomes autonomous, essentially unstoppable, and does things that we can't even understand how it's doing them.
Yeah, so what happened with the Akacha Grace studies is she did a study. I think the first one she did, let me see here, I think it was 2020.
2022 and 2024.
She asked...
I think I may not be quite correct. Sorry.
2022. She asked a bunch of AI professionals a bunch of questions about when is AGI going to arrive. And
when is ASI?
ASI going to arrive.
Yeah.
And she tabled those numbers. Now, whether those numbers are accurate or not, the more important part of her work is she did it again in 2024. And the numbers had reduced dramatically. So all these experts had said, oh, no, by 2100, this thing is going to be super intelligent. Now they're saying by 2047. And I absolutely guarantee you that in your next study, they'll say it's 6 or 7 years away.
Yes. Yeah. That in and of itself is quite striking.
Yeah.
Are there more you'd like to say about ASI? Because I think then we could go to the psychological impact of all this.
I think we should move on to the psychological impact. I would like to say one thing is that these estimates and projections of AI professionals are heavily contested. But the principle of AI beginning to encroach on the things that we used to fondly think are our own, which, by the way, started with when a machine beat Garry Kasparov's chess. That was 1997. And then it became the greatest chess player in the world, and then became the greatest Go player in the world, and now it becomes the greatest protein scientist in the world. These skittles where we look at things that we think are our own just drop every single day. There is another announcement, Barnaby, where it takes your breath away. Nobody is saying that the stuff is not happening. There is contestation as to rates, and there's contestation as to the importance of this.
Yeah. And those are important things to consider. The rapidity, the exponential rapidity. I remember when I first heard you talk about this, you said in relation to some development, but it's probably only a couple of months away. 6 months away, we'll be able to do this, and this. And the fact that AI experts underestimate the rapidity of development of their own field is actually quite striking.
Yeah, before we drop into psychology, let me give one final example of how this goes. One of the most important studies in biology is in microbiology is the study of DNA, and one of the most important things the study of DNA is the study of proteins, which play a major role in all living things. Proteins, which are molecules, are the things that run around our body and do stuff. They build stuff. They give us our blue eyes, and they give the shape of our ears and the length of our fingers, etc., etc. The engine is determined by DNA, but the proteins are the engines that actually build us. Now, these molecules, which are made up of a chain of amino acids, they fold into very complex 3D shapes. And these 3D shapes have been a quandary for scientists for the longest time because they're so complicated. Why do they really want to know how these 3D shapes work? Because when there is a misfolding of the protein, we get terrible things like Parkinson's and Huntington's disease. It's a sickle cell anemia, just absolutely awful stuff. So if you can understand how these things fold into the 3D shapes that they end up as, you have a chance of being able to address these diseases. So what happened with AI? Prior to AI, they used all sorts of techniques, crystallography, blah, 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 blah. It would take one researcher, one scientist, 2 years to understand the 3D structure of a single protein. By 2017, they had decoded about 20,000 proteins, and then AI was let loose. In fact, it was the same program that they built to win the Go game. It was let loose on proteins. There are 200 million proteins running around our bodies. They had decoded about 20,000 of them, and within 3 months, AI had decoded all 200 million proteins. That scale from 20,000 that humans could do using lab equipment to 200 millions that they could do with this technology is the best example I can think of as to the promise on the optimistic side of this.
The promise on the optimistic side. Let's, I think you have brilliantly illustrated with great brevity but power how much this is really going to affect all of us in ways that are almost unimaginable. And in that sense, this, what we are, I was going to say whimsically, but not so whimsically, calling the fourth great insult to human narcissism, and an insult of a different caliber from the three that Freud nominated, must be taken very, very seriously, because it's going to affect, unlike the Copernican or the Darwinian, or perhaps even the Freudian revolution, this revolution is going to affect existentially our lived experience, our phenomenology as human beings, how we find ourselves in the world, how we think about ourselves in the world, and what we are or are not able to do in the world. So I would suggest that maybe we turn now to the Freud famously said that the important things in life were to work and to love. The important human accomplishments, to work and to love. And many of us in the psychoanalytic profession have wanted to add a third, which is to play. Arbeiten, lieben und spielen. To work, to love, and to play. Perhaps we could look at each of those arenas briefly.
Sure.
Work, you've already touched on a lot of things that the protein researcher has been overtaken by AI and his or her capacity to find new proteins and to understand them. But what in general are your thoughts about how employment, both manual and non-manual employment, are going to be affected?
Okay, so there are some, there is a fair amount of data research that's been done on this. Let's just talk about the most obvious one. Is this thing coming to take my job? That's what everybody's really interested in. The answer is, in most cases, yes, and I'll give you a couple of those figures. These come from Pricewaterhouse and McKinsey, but you find similar ones from the other big researchers' houses. The forecast is somewhere between 300 million and 800 million jobs will be lost to AI by 2030. I tend to think that's an underestimate. By the way, the reason why it's a widespread is I think PwC came up with 300 million and McKinsey came up with 800 million. I think it is an underestimate in some regards. AI, surprisingly, where people expected it to knock over jobs, was in the low skill areas. In fact, it's knocking over jobs in the high skill areas at a much greater rate. I'll give you 2 examples. I have been involved with a law firm who is getting AI to write opinions at a level of an advocate. Now, they did this very quietly. So what they did is they not only used ChatGPT, because obviously ChatGPT speaks English very well, but they fed it another corpus of training data, which was the entire South African legal history. All the court cases, all the precedents, all the opinions, all the articles that's been written were fed in, connected together, and then they asked the AI to present an argument which would convince a judge on a certain matter that was going to go to the High Court. This thing spat out 100 pages in about 15 minutes, which they then sent unedited to a real advocate without telling him there was AI, and said, "What do you think of this opinion?" And the advocate said, "This is the most brilliant opinion I've ever read. Who wrote it?" In which case, of course, they had to reveal, and I believe that the advocate was not happy. So at that level of skill, it was able to understand how legal arguments were built, how to grab precedents that were appropriate, how to structure the article, how to build a narrative, and how to take the judge's hand and walk him slowly through the case in order to get a positive judgment. The other one is obviously in the area of medicine, where any medical doctor coming out has spent the last 7 or 8 years studying textbooks, and puny little human brains do not have the ability to remember all of that stuff. AI does, and its capability within the diagnostic area far exceeds capabilities of the best diagnosticians, because it can get to a lot more stuff. That stuff obviously is still monitored by humans. Nobody's going to let it loose without some human oversight. Consultancies. There is somebody that I know quite well who got a contract with a big consultancy to write a very large paper on a very particular abstruse subject, which was the effect of AI in a certain industry. He wrote up his proposal. He sent an invoice for a big check, and he fed his proposal into AI, and 4 minutes later he had the 50-page proposal, and he said he couldn't improve upon it. So all of this stuff is happening in the industries where it's supposed to be white collar. Finance is another one. When people go into university to study finance and they get their CFAs or CPAs, what they are really doing is they are people who are very smart at repeating complex algorithms and putting data into them. They're all going to lose their jobs. Stock pickers are going to lose their jobs. It's going to be better than AI. So there's this whole swath of human activity at the higher levels of intellect which are going to start to fall over. And there are already companies, I don't want to go into it because we're probably going to end up short on time, already companies that are firing large groups of people at the middle management level.
Yeah, so this is not just manual jobs that will be taken over by robots. Right. This are the higher planes of intellectual job. And of course, right at the end of this podcast, we should have some brief thoughts about psychotherapists and psychoanalysts being taken over.
Right.
But perhaps in relation to that, we should go from work to love.
Right.
Love, which sentimentally as humans, we like to think is an almost unique capacity, for want of a better word, that we have. I remember a joke by Woody Allen. Woody Allen, in his early adulthood, used to do stand-up comedy, and he used to do it superbly because his sense of timing was remarkable. And I remember one vignette when he he drops his voice and he says to the audience, "This has been a very bad week for me because my father was laid off. He was laid off from the factory that he'd worked in for 30 years. And they replaced him. And they replaced him with a machine this big," and he indicates with his hand something less than the size of a bread box. And they replaced him with just a machine this big. And then he pauses. He had impeccable timing, and he says, "And the really depressing thing is the next day, my mother ran out and bought one."
Yes.
So this bespeaks, in a way, the question of, can we preserve something that is sacred, that is meaningful, that is emotional, that is spiritual, about the contact between human beings that we call love. Can we preserve it as part of exclusively the human domain? Although we know that there are animals that have similar types of bonding. And I understand that there's an escalation of commerce in artificial intelligence girlfriends, and I assume boyfriends.
Yeah, so a research from, it was probably sometime last year in Wired magazine, showed that there were 29,000 ads on Facebook for men looking for AI girlfriends. This coincides very neatly with two things. It coincides with the fact that an AI girlfriend can be designed to be extremely empathetic and patient, and saying the right thing at the same time, and giving praise or not at the same time, and engaging in interesting conversations or challenging at the right time. And the epidemic of loneliness that is now, read in the headlines all the times, particularly in the United States, as a result of people spending a lot of time digitally and not with other human beings. If you are to contemplate getting in online with an empathetic human voice who fulfills all of those requirements that you would have of a girlfriend, let's leave sex out of it for the moment, and we'll get back to it in a second. All of those requirements, somebody who understands your interests and knows all the sports trivia and has read all the philosophers because you're interested in philosophy, but won't bother you when you're in a bad mood, etc., etc., etc. You have an absolutely perfect recipe of finding the perfect girlfriend, which you will not be able to find in real life.
Well, and I think importantly, not just that she shares your sense of humor, your fundamental beliefs, and she knows all the sports trivia that you want to know, but perhaps a girlfriend that challenges you in ways that might be exciting, stimulating, and yet sufficiently comfortable that you remain where you are.
Exactly.
Which is what we get from really good friendships.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then, of course, the question arises, okay, I've been able to extract from an AI system my perfect girlfriend. Now I would like to move on to the all-important subject of sex.
Yeah.
And how do we achieve that? That's coming too. It's the advances in haptics. Haptics is a word that relates to touch, smell, feel, taste, etc., the 5 or 6 senses. The advantages of automated and AI-driven haptics are absolutely extraordinary what's happening at the edges. The advantage on human-like flesh and soft material are extraordinary. And I have little doubt that the market for people wanting to actually have sex with robots at some point in the future will be insatiable. Once you put the sex part of it together with the great personality part of it together, do we have a situation where love is subsumed into the Uber AI or not?
Yeah, I think that's a very precise way of putting it, an alarming way of putting it. We already have, in the last 20 years or more, avatar chat rooms in which people have very realistic sex. But now the idea that one could hire a partner or purchase a partner who is robotically controlled to be absolutely someone one would feel oneself to be falling in love with, and that he or she might have an actual physical capacity, that there could be sensual sexual gratification as well. It really does challenge what it means to us to fall in love.
Yeah, just before we leave that subject, Barnaby, I think a lot of people remember a bunch of very good movies and books on the subject. Ian McEwan's I, Robot, and the movie She with I can't remember what the actor's name was, and there are 2 or 3 others whose names escape me, but they've all addressed this very topic in different ways, and it's difficult to see whether this thing would actually work in real life. But there is no, and this is the important part, there is no physical reason why it should not.
Yeah. Let's move off this falling in love to just talk about the third thing that I think psychoanalysts recognize as important for mental health, which is play. You made the point earlier that that AI can be creative you were slightly ambiguous about whether it could actually rival Beethoven or Picasso. But I mean, I think that's an interesting ambiguity in the position you take. But you were very clear that the bulk of creative activity could be done as well or better, and certainly faster and more economically by AI. So I don't know about the outer reaches of creativity. So I asked you in an earlier conversation we had, well, why do you say there may be exceptions? You said at one point to me, it's possible but far from certain that AI will never rival Beethoven, Charlie Parker, Renoir, Picasso, Dostoevsky, or Philip Roth. But I'm not sure, as I talk to you, whether you can actually be so sure that those creative geniuses will not be rivaled.
Perhaps I was not clear in what I meant. There would be no reason to create another Picasso or another Philip Roth. They may well be as creative as them in a new and novel way.
Yeah, okay.
But the wounds that they will cause in the creative community will be to the rump of people who are good, mediocre, pretty good, even very good. That's where everybody lives. They don't live in the Picasso and Philip Roth world.
Okay, good. That's a good clarification.
Yeah.
But thinking on a more mundane, everyday level, how we enjoy our creativity, one of the things that is in the psychoanalytic literature that comes out of Winnicott is the squiggle game, where a patient makes a squiggle, seemingly randomly, but I realize the word randomly is problematic, and then the therapist does, and then they figure what did they do, what associations do they have to what is essentially a self-created projective test. I find myself wondering, first of all, could a computer be programmed to play the squiggle game? That's one question, and I think the answer to that has to be yes.
Yes.
Could a computer play a squiggle game with another computer, and then they could both speculate as to what the meanings were of the squiggles they had produced? And I think the answer is yes. But then for me, in this rather depressing conversation, I got to the point of, well, would a computer ever want to play a squiggle game by itself?
Yeah, I suppose we could go beyond that. Why would a computer want to play squiggle of its own accord, either by itself or against another computer or against a human? What would drive it? What would be its motivation to do that? Humans have a motivation to do that. The motivation that they have is that being whimsical is pleasurable.
Yes.
You do it. It's creative. It's fun. Does a computer want to have a fun without having been distinctly programmed to have fun? So I need to go back to the fact of the autonomous computer that creates its own goals. And I suppose the best I can say about that, if a computer is creating its own goals, writing its own software, evolving itself, there may be an evolutionary imperative to play, to have whimsy. It may discover that on its own, and therefore will do things whimsical because it gets it to move ahead in the evolutionary chain.
That's a fascinating thought, especially since when I remember reading in graduate school the literature on play, no one is quite sure why play has evolutionary significance. Some species seem to, some species don't. But it's interesting you're saying that AI could evolve such that it needed some sort of capacity for play, which would be very fascinating. So I think we should go to the thorny questions that we don't really want to confront as mental health professionals, which is how much is our work going to be replaced by AI? And you were telling me a story about one of the very first programs that emulated the work of a psychotherapist.
Yeah, the name of the program was Eliza, and this was in the dark ages of computing. And it was written by a guy, I think his name was Weizenbaum.
Are we talking about dark ages in like 1960s? Or?
Yes,
yeah.
1960s,
okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he wrote a very simple program which was supposed to mimic a psychologist. It did it with no depth whatsoever. It basically asked the person at the end of what was then a teletype machine, well, how do you feel about that, as one would see in the cliche of what a psychologist does. And he came out of his office. He was both a psychologist and a computer programmer. came out of his office after developing this thing and asking his secretary to play with it, to find his secretary crying. And his secretary was crying because the AI program called Eliza, she felt that this was the first person who had ever understood her. And she had burst into tears. He immediately retracted from ethical grounds for her ever using the thing again. But it was one of the first attempts at this, which leads directly into the question which you've talked about a lot, is to what extent can AI take over the role of the psychoanalyst or psychologist on all the many levels that they would interact with one of their clients?
Yeah, I think I think it's very clear that one can imagine a program with a therapist. And one can imagine an AI therapist having all the data from all the psychotherapy facts that we know about. One can imagine it being a very good, insightful, and empathic psychotherapist. And I think this is on its way. And in my own professional contacts, when I talk about this, I find people falling back on, well, but there's something different about talking to a human. But in a way, we've already sounded the alarm on that defense, because when we talked about falling in love, are you going to know? And if you do therapy virtually, you don't really know what is at the other end of the camera. And in the falling in love situation, and of course it's not coincidental that I'm talking about psychotherapeutic relationships and falling in love relationships, because in both arenas we think there's something special. But when we invoked the image of this robot that has beautiful silicone skin and so on and so on and so forth, falling in love with a female partner such as that, even if you know this is not really a human, how much difference does that make? You know, people go into psychotherapy and have strong feelings about their psychotherapist, and they know that the psychotherapist has other patients, and they know that this is what the psychotherapist does for a living. But it doesn't make a difference when you come to the strong feelings of wanting to love your therapist or wanting to hate your therapist, etc. So I fall back a bit on there being a distinction, which is something I've written about extensively, between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. But when you come to psychoanalysis, there seem to be three, and we're not going to develop this here, there's not time, but there seem to be three sorts of issues that are very pertinent to the question, to what extent? And it is to what extent, it's not if AI is going to take over the world of mental health. The first, to me, is what is special about free association. And we can't go in any depth to that question, but to me there's something very special about free association, which a major piece of my career has been writing about. But the fact of the matter is, even psychoanalytic therapists, many of them do not really value free association in the way that I think it needs to be valued. The second area is the question of the expression of feelings. Can an AI mimic feelings? Psychotherapists need to have feelings. They're not robotic. I mean, that's what we were taught in graduate school. We're taught to be emotionally engaged with our patients to greater or lesser extent. And the answer, of course, I suppose that you're going to give is that if you give an AI program enough data, it will know when, where, and how it should express feelings in the way that a human psychotherapist would. Not just any psychotherapist, a very good psychotherapist. And then I think you get to more sophisticated questions, such as the question of projective identification, that a lot of what we talk about in psychoanalysis is the capacity for the patient to evoke feelings in the psychoanalyst or psychotherapist. But this is principally a psychoanalytic notion. And again, one wonders whether one can be optimistic about this, because the computer is never going to have feelings in the ordinary sense that humans have feelings. but it is damn well going to know in a very sophisticated manner how to mimic them.
Yeah, and then of course this leads to the deeply contentious area of, if you build a machine that is able to mimic feelings exactly, how does that differ from having them?
Yeah. So tell us your concluding thoughts about this in relation to mental health, because we talking about this now as you and I are deciding together that this is indeed the fourth and most serious blow to human narcissism, because it affects people, unlike the other blows to human narcissism, not just our identification with the species, but it affects our everyday life in very practical ways of work, love, and play. This is going to wound a lot of people and going to require sensitivity by mental health professionals, I would imagine. What is your view? Okay,
so let me give you my concluding thoughts specifically with respect to mental health. And as your listeners know, I'm not a psychologist, so take this from whence it comes. The pretty fantastic scenarios, I use that in the sense of either good or bad, that I have presented.
Phantasmagoric.
Yeah, phantasmagoric would be better. Scenarios that I presented as to what's coming can easily be dismissed because it is so much like science fiction. And you've got to be kidding. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. AI is never going to do that stuff. I would urge listeners to look at the edges, and the stuff is available on Google Scholar or anything else. What is happening on the edges? The stuff is coming, and it is coming so fast that on a daily basis, my jaw drops to the floor because it's happening so quickly, being built by the smartest minds. So I want to start off by saying all of these scenarios that are presented are on our doorstep.
Yeah.
Even if you don't see them today, you will see them tomorrow. The second one is that I think our most important problem that we are going to face is what we called, I think you were right to coin the term, the walking wounded. People who have lost their jobs to AI, whose sense of purpose and sense of self have disappeared, musicians who can't get jobs anymore in the studios, instrumentalists, writers who can't get jobs, copywriters whose jobs have completely disappeared to AI. There will be a whole slew of people who are going to be miserable, unhappy, and with a complete loss of identity. Those people need to be taken care of. And the third area is the area of harnessing this tool to assist the psychoanalyst or psychotherapist to give that help. And we've talked a little bit about that. So we have, the downside scenario of lost jobs and lost identity and sense of self disappearing and people with lost jobs and no income happening very fast. And we have the upside is maybe we can turn this on its head and bring AI into the game as something that can save people's sense of well-being.
Yeah, I think the walking wounded and the desperation that this could create when you discover that what you thought you were good at, what you built your self-esteem around feeling you were competent, effective, when that is knocked out from under you, is a considerable wounding for individuals. Professor Sidley, thank you so much. We are actually planning to follow this podcast up with a second podcast in which I'm going to interview Boyke about a lecture that he has given that has been very impactful in universities across the country on the utopian and dystopian images or conclusions that we can arrive at when we look at the development of AI. And you had named this lecture.
The name of the lecture is, this is my cynical way of trying to get people into a lecture hall. The name of the lecture is called We're All Gonna Die. And it is unpacking the utopian and dystopian narratives, of which there are both, and which both are extreme, in order to give a real sense of hype versus reality and the pace at which it's moving.
And I very much look forward, with trepidation, to introducing you, giving that lecture. Boyke, Professor Sidley, thank you very much, and thank you all of you who have listened.
Thank you, Barnaby, Professor Barratt.